Good morning. All right, awesome. So there was a slight, typo. There won't actually be audience questions for this panel today. Rather, it'll just be a facilitated discussion, and I'll be your host. And I've invited up Cedric, Joe, and Elijah to be our panelists today to speak to us and continue the conversation about singleness, but not so much just from the perspective of one who is single, but also, as you can see, from the perspective of two who have already gotten married and are coming out of singleness. And our intent today is twofold. For those of you who are single, is to encourage you and to help you navigate through that season in your life. And for those of you who aren't, it is for us as a church to come around those who are single and to understand how to care for, minister, and encourage them in a way that is Christ-centered and helpful for them. So without further ado, we're going to use that mic over there. And would you each go ahead and introduce yourselves?
So most of you know me. My name is Elijah Grubb. I am an elder a teaching team here at the Vineyard. And by way of introduction to the topic of singleness, I have been married for about 12 years now. So I've been married, most of my adult life. But there was a short period after I was first born again where I thought I was going to be a celibate single Christian my whole life. Stay short, it lasted like 9 months. But I was really short for like 9 months at 16 years old, which people found really weird. So I have some thoughts on singleness.
So my name is Joe. I have spent 25 years as a single person. If we're counting adult years, I guess that's 7 years. And I have been married for 3.5 years now. I have done a lot of work around just healthy relationships, learning about it, and also kind of talking other people through it. And yeah, I have a big passion for healthy relationships amongst single people, amongst married people, amongst dating people, and all people in between.
Hi, my name is Cedric. I'm the unmarried one. I'm currently dating though, and before that I was single for about 4 years, and before that I had my longest relationship, which was about a year, which was an interesting relationship. But during that 4-year period, I was taking everything that I learned from that previous relationship, and I also thought at some point that I was going to be single for the rest of my life. But we'll talk about that later.
Excellent. All right. So before we jump into some of the questions that we have, I just wanted to recap briefly a little bit of where we're coming from as we sort of respond to Angie's sermon on singleness last week. So if you recall, and if you weren't here, I think there were 2 main points that she made, one at the very beginning and one at the very end. And the first point was that singleness is indeed a gift from God. And it must be treated as a precious time given and purposed by God for you in your sanctification. And the second, not unrelated to that, is that the only way that your cup can be full is not by looking for it in another person who you're dating or intending to marry, but rather only in your relationship with God. Right? If you go into a relationship with your cup half full or barely full because you don't know who you are in Christ, then when you bring that into your marriage, looking to fulfill and fill that cup, then you just go back and forth trying to fill each other's cup, but it will never be full. And not just that, but if Christ is at the center of your relationship, then your cups will also be overflowing. So kind of in response to that, one of our first questions, most pertinent questions to get started today is, what should we be doing as a church to support for, care for, and not shame those who are single?
Okay, do you all have that question down? Do you mind if we pray real quick?
Yeah.
Okay, sweet.
Go for it.
Lord, thank you so much that we had this opportunity to just really discuss your intention for singleness and marriage as well. I just pray that you calm down my nerves at least, and just allow just truth to come out, God. Allow us to glorify you with this panel. In Jesus' name. Yeah, of course. Right, and so as a church, there's just a couple things that I would point out from my experience. One is I've been blessed to go to churches that have been really, really great with singleness. For instance, the Vineyard hosted a singleness, dating, and relationships conference here like 3 years ago, which was really great. And although she doesn't remember it, it's where I first laid eyes on my current partner. And anyway, so I thought that was definitely intentional for the church to at least get that conversation started. Also, my church that I went to in Kansas, as well as church here, I think you all are very intentional about focusing on the kingdom and focusing on missions, because I think that that's what's mostly helped me in the church, is focusing not on whether or not I'm married or am I dating, but focusing on what I can do on my current stage as a Christian, and how I can pursue a relationship with God. And so I think that's been incredible. One thing I will say, though, is that whenever we have conversations about the elder board, it tends to be about the elder board and the elder board's wives. And so it never really swayed me one way or another, but it's just something that it might have, I don't know, been a focus of other people as well.
Yeah, I would say like the biggest thing is probably being open to one another, whether or not you're single or married. Just really being open and kind of really willing to let people into your circle. And I think I think sometimes as married people we can get like really engrossed in like your like married life and like your family life, but kind of like thinking of like how can you bring other people into that, because family is not just for yourself, but it's for others as well. I think that's the biggest thing. I think, speaking as someone who has lived in a new city as a single person, that was huge in like helping me felt like I belong, as being in a church where I felt like I had community, felt like there were people that I could go to and rely on for, like things that like maybe you would normally rely on for like family, that you would rely on family for. So things like moving, like if I were to end up in the emergency department, like who would come and sit with me, like things like that. So that's like one of the biggest things. I think I think we as a church can also be more intentional about talking about both singleness and marriage. I don't think we should assume that single people have no interest about talking about marriage. I think actually, if anything, when I was single, at least, I really wanted to learn more, and I really did want to learn, like, what does a healthy marriage look like? How can I be loving others still in my singleness as well?
So before I answer the question, can I follow up, Cedric, with something you said? When you mentioned the conversations about the elders and their wives, are you saying that you feel that in some ways gives a perspective, like in order to be an elder, you need to be married?
So although I think subliminally, yeah. Although I know that's not true, in my mind, I just picture someone on the elder board having a wife.
When I first joined the elder board, I was not married.
Yeah, okay.
So
Yeah, I was gonna ask
there's
you.
that.
No, that's really helpful, though. I appreciate that, because it's certainly not the perspective that we want to advance. So if it's happening, then yeah, no, that's good to know. I appreciate you bringing that up. So I actually want to step back a little bit and cheat, if that's okay. I think we need to define singleness, because I'm not sure that there is a common conception of singleness between our culture and what we're talking about in the church, right? So being single in culture, especially if you're a young male, right, can sound like it rocks. It means that you get to hook up with whoever you want, whenever you want, but you don't have the constraints of a committed relationship. And that's not what we mean in the church, okay, or anything like that. So singleness can have different ideas. So what do we mean in the church? I mean, and you guys can feel free to push back or qualify this. But I think what we're really talking about at its root is committed sexual abstinence, a situation in life where you are committed to living sexually without sexual intimacy. But that also does not mean a commitment to living without intimacy, which is very crucial. Because there's a lot of singles in culture that are sexually active and do not enjoy intimacy. And so we have a very different conception there. Ideally, a single person who's a Christian will be enjoying all kinds of intimate relationships, but they are choosing for the sake of the kingdom of God not to express their sexuality with another person. Okay, so getting to this question of how do we keep from shaming, encouraging feelings of shame in singles in the church. Well, this isn't going to be that practical. It's going to be overly theological, which is what you've all come to expect from me. But here you go, theological answer. Well, I think it really has to be about rooting out idolatrous views of what marriage and perhaps sometimes singleness is about. Let's face it, in our culture, on the one hand, we have every chick flick, every love movie out there, right? They live happily ever after, often because they're enjoying this sexual relationship again, where it's all rosy and maybe they've had some, at the climax they had to work through some tensions, but it seems like sort of the beginning of their relationship is happily ever after. And anyone who's been married for more than like a month knows that like putting the ring on and starting life together is only the beginning of a very checkered happily ever after, right? It's a happily ever after, hopefully, that is permeated with times of sadness and trouble and tension. And this is the very means by which God produces in us holiness. But we have a culture on the one hand that idolizes, if not marriage relationships, and shames, right, the idea of the kind of single life we're talking about. Think of the movie 40-Year-Old Virgin. Even if you haven't seen it, the title kind of gives it away. Right, the whole movie played by this character, Steve Carell, is about this guy that's just apparently a total loser because he's 40 years old and he's a virgin. And the Bible gives us a very different picture. We worship a virgin who was 33 when he was crucified and never experienced sexual fulfillment, though I would argue he certainly experienced intimacy. So we have to break down that idol. And the church has gone back and forth, right? In periods of the church, marriage has been somewhat degraded, and singleness has been viewed as kind of the ultimate calling. But today, at least in the American evangelical context, and American context more broadly, it's the opposite. There's something wrong with you, at least if you're not living a sexually fulfilled life. You might be able to be single, but if you're not living a sexually fulfilled life, there's something wrong with you. And that is not biblical. We need to situate both the conversation of marriage and singleness in the greater conversation of discipleship and conformity to the image of Christ. And if that is our goal, then what causes shame is not singleness or marriage, but is rather simply those things that are at odds with Christian character. So that's a starting point.
Oh, yeah, I guess I should briefly talk about that. When I was at KU as an undergrad, I was dating this woman for about a year, and it was a relationship that was very interesting. We did end up having sex, and it kind of caused a lot of issues with our relationship. And it caused issues in a way because I was a Christian at the time, and what I believed as a very strong Christian. But it was really difficult for me to continue that relationship, and everything that was going on in my head, everything that was going on in my spiritual life, it was definitely at odds with each other, and that relationship ended up becoming something that was very toxic. And so everything that I learned during that relationship was really about what I'm looking for in a relationship with God, because I knew that this relationship with her was not a relationship that really respected God, respected his boundaries. So During the 4 years, it took 4 years. If you told me that it was going to take 4 years before I was dating again, I would have been very upset. But during the fourth year, actually, on like the fourth anniversary, if you will, of me not dating, the thought came back to me because it has during that 4 years was like, what if you were single for the rest of your life? Would you be able to accept that? And I was like, absolutely not. Like it wasn't something that I was interested in. But on that fourth year, I seriously took it to prayer because I was like, what if I will be single for the rest of my life? Would I be okay with that? And I was just thinking like, what has happened during this 4 years that I wouldn't love to do for the rest of my life? I've had guys come alongside me and just walk with me through so many of my issues. And I was just like, that's just such a great example of love, married guys and single guys. So it's just been such an incredible experience and just really getting to know God's heart for me through the guys that are around me, through the relationships that I was building. And I was just thinking, like, what is wrong with this life? I believe that God definitely has, I don't think singleness is necessarily temporary. It could be permanent, but I was really living like it was just a temporary thing. And so that really prevented me from seeing certain things that God was doing in my life, certain mission fields that he was calling me to. And so, again, on the fourth year, I said, you know what, God, if you want me to do this for the rest of my life, I am all for it. If that's what you want, please don't let it be what you want. But I am here for it. And yeah, so it's something that I think everyone should, at least if you're not married, really focus on how God is allowing you to complete your mission here on earth.
Yeah, I also wanted, I don't know if we're going to get to this question later, but I did also want to kind of go off of what Elijah was saying about sexual abstinence, because I think sometimes what gets in the way of genuine relationships in the church is sexual sin. And I'm saying that as like amongst single people and married people. I think, when you don't know how to have like a pure relationship with people that you're not married to, it can really get in the way of being honest with them, being open with them, and letting people feel like they can trust each other. And yeah, so I don't have too much else to expound on that. That's it.
So I guess I want to say a little bit more about defining singleness, just in light of what Sue said and Tim, because that was really good. Yeah, so when we're talking about singleness in the church, we're not talking about being unmarried. In fact, today, we might describe those who are married as being unsingle, right? We have to remember that in the consummation of the kingdom of God, when God makes all things new, when he completes that work, the state of all will be that our sexuality is fully fulfilled in our union with Christ. That is the goal of our sexuality, whether married or single, right? I read an audiobook this week that is excellent. I mean, if you want to think serious about singleness, I don't read a lot of practical books. I basically read dense theology. This is not that. This is a very practical book, and it was one of the best practical books I've ever heard, certainly the best I've ever listened to on singleness. It's called 7 Myths About Singleness by Sam Allberry. 7 Myths About Singleness. But one of the things that he said in that book, it might not be an exact quote, but he said if that marriage essentially gives us the shape of the gospel, singleness shows us its sufficiency. If marriage shows us the shape of the gospel, singleness shows us its sufficiency. We have to remember that those who are single in the church are actually, in some ways, living out the ethic of the future kingdom today. This isn't to demean marriage by any means. But one of the other things that Sam Allberry says in this book, he says we have a way of talking about when we're single and we're down on it. We compare the downs of singleness with the ups of marriage. And if we're married and we're not particularly happy in our marriage, we compare the downs of marriage with the ups of singleness. But really, you have to compare the ups of marriage with the ups of singleness and the downs of marriage with the downs of singleness, okay? I am very thankful that God, provided the gift of my wife and the gift of marriage and the gift of my kids. We're talking about this last night, and I said, I'm convinced I would be I'm already not very patient, but I'd be a far less patient, far less compassionate, far less kind person without my wife and my kids, because I am a very selfish person by nature, and they have sought to draw that out so much in me and reveal how selfish I really am. However, if I were single, I would also have a tremendous more time to devote to kingdom work. We have to remember that if in creation, God made a mandate to fill the earth, in new creation, Jesus makes a mandate to make disciples. Most of my time and energy right now goes into making 3 disciples. Their names are Luciana, David, and Olivia. That's where most of my energy goes, and I would say rightfully so. But those of you who are called to be single, you can have a far bigger spiritual family than that, potentially. Of course, I can too, but I'm just saying a lot of my energy has to go into those 3 spiritual children. And those of you who are single just don't have some of those limitations that I have. So I say that's one of the areas that you have to compare, right? The ups with the ups and the downs with the downs. And so much of this conversation gets so wrapped up in like what the world thinks of singleness, which is being unmarried, right? Or unhooked. And it's viewed as this condition you have. Yeah, it's not. It's not. These are gifts and callings of God, and each are to be honored in the kingdom.
Okay. Well, thank you guys for those both thought-provoking and very vulnerable responses. Something that seems like you're kind of alluding to is that sexuality and kind of being satisfied in the intimacy of relationships are not necessarily one and the same, and that actually in the midst of singleness, one of the ways that you can have intimate relationship with others is, literally through just your community in the church, and that can satisfy you and allow you and strengthen you as you're kind of waiting for both to be married or ultimately the long-term marriage and union with Christ. So moving a little bit from the theological to the practical then, what have you done or how are you doing that today as you continue, likely right now in the middle of a pandemic, to wrestle with loneliness and kind of feeling isolated and such? How would you encourage those in the church who are feeling that way?
I would say that this is probably going to be different for everybody, because I think what the pandemic has showed me is that I thought that my life before the pandemic was kind of very, very busy. Like I was doing a lot of activities. I was seeing a lot of people throughout the day, and I thought this is what I kind of needed to do to like be normal or like feel like social or whatever you want to call it. After the pandemic hit, I just realized that I can be very happy with a small circle of people. And I know that that's not true of everybody. But I guess for me, even though I'm happy with a small circle, that circle is far away, right? Like there's a lot of people that I would consider in my circle that live across the country, live in a different state. And so it's kind of just really being honest with yourself about what it is that you feel like you need and what it is that you can like maybe just ask for other people. Because I think we'll find that sometimes that just asking is like this really big step for us, but a lot of people are just waiting to be asked. And I don't know what that looks like for you. What makes you feel like you're filled up? Is it long conversation? Is it like having recreation with people? Is it being able to unload your burdens on somebody? And I think that goes back to what Angie was saying about knowing yourself. Because I think a lot of people going into the pandemic probably just didn't have a whole lot of awareness about what it is about themselves, that, how do their emotions work? What makes them feel filled up, And I think because the pandemic just kind of quieted everything down, and we're spending all this time just by ourselves, I think that's when a lot of these things can come to light. And I would just challenge anyone here who, maybe you filled up a lot of your free time with like binge watching Netflix or like, I don't know what else, other kind of hobbies that you filled it up with. But if you've done those things too, if you realize that those things are distracting you from kind of sitting with yourself and getting to know those things that really fulfill you, then I would challenge to really dig in and do that work, like Angie was saying.
I don't know how many of you are familiar with Shane Claiborne, but I remember a number of years ago hearing him say something that has stuck with me. And it was that anyone can live without sex, but no one can live without love. Anyone can live without sex, but no one can live without love. Again, it's one of those messages that I think our culture gets exactly opposite. Again, just watch a show. Right? That's kind of the message of so many shows that are on, is that, like, God forbid you're gonna have to go 30 days without sex, unless you're married, of course, and then it's sexless because marriage is awful. But for anybody else, right, it's unthinkable that you'd be living without sex. But no one can live without love, and that is the Christian perspective. So there's two ways that I think, right, we're to cultivate intimacy. And the first is in the context of community, right? That's why, in part, we do go to church, is because God created us, right? Angie, one of the best statements she made last week, I thought was a fantastic statement, is that when she said that, when she said that God saw that it was not good that Adam was alone, right? And alone does not mean just sexless, that you can, in fact, you can be in a sexual relationship and be alone, right? But that it wasn't good that he was alone. And there are multiple ways that can be fulfilled. God did not create us to be alone, and so we need community. But beyond that, let's face it, many of us, especially those that are more introverted, have probably been there, where you're in a church, and maybe you go every week, maybe you're faithful about going, but you're still basically alone. And I think one of the most important other things missing in many people's lives are real friendships. And in the age of social media, right, in an age where you can have 1,000 or 2,000 or 5,000 so-called friends, I think we've lost what it actually means to have a friend. And Christian friendship is really important. Having someone or people in your life who will not only love you and party with you and hang out with you in the good times, but will cry with you or chastise you in the hard times, who know you that well, who you're open enough with that they'll call you out when you need to be called out, even if it creates some tension, right? That is really important in a Christian's life. And that, I think, is where so many of us are actually going to find that intimacy. Let's face it, sometimes for those of us who are married, we know that in our marriages, there have at least been times, and maybe long times, where we don't actually experience that kind of intimacy, that kind of friendship, right? So just because you're married and even having sex isn't always intimate, right? Sex can very easily become something that's self-centered and lacks intimacy. But when it comes from out of a deep friendship and a deep nourishing relationship that happens between a husband and a wife, I think that's where even intimacy in sex can come. So the point is, outside of that marital relationship, you can have intimacy and are called to have intimacy with someone. And what I think I'm learning, what this book helped me learn that I was listening to this week, is that the challenge for some of those of us who are married in the church is to both remember that intimacy is important. And sometimes that might mean also deep friendships outside of marriage for those of us who are married, but also that we are called to invite single people into our lives to experience some of that intimacy. Right? And I think about like one of Amanda's best friends. She's a minister for Crew, lives out in Albany, and she'll come out sometimes and spend like, sometimes almost a week and just hanging out. It's a kind of relationship where she can scold our kids, and she just hangs out and does life with us. And it's really just it really is family. There's just that level of intimacy there and openness, and that's really important. And so maybe that's also an encouragement for us who are married, that there may be singles in this church who aren't feeling an intimacy and are feeling lonely, and it may be kind of the fault of those of us who are married, just kind of forgetting that that's really important for everyone, is to experience that. So we also need to be proactive in inviting those into those and people into those intimate relationships, even within our own family.
I don't remember what the question was, but I do want to second what Elijah just said. When I did first come here to Vineyard, when I started this graduate program, I was actually, I was super nervous to even ask anyone if I could just come into their home. And I don't think I actually have yet, but Julie Kuplin, she actually got up and she said, "Hey, you know what? If anyone wants to come to our house, just hang out, please do." I never took her up on that offer. I'm sorry, Julie, but I definitely started frequenting Akina and Peter's place, or Peter and Emily's place, and then just other couples, just seeing what it is that they do in their household. So I definitely think that's important. And so if you are open to having singles come and enjoy that intimacy, please invite us, but also make sure that we come. Or don't force us, of course. But times are tough right now, so.
Oh, all right, awesome. Oh, did you want to go for it? Yes.
I would also say all these things that we're talking about having real Christian friendships and having real relationships with people, I think a lot of people underestimate how important those relational skills are for marriage. I think, and I'm speaking as someone, I used to have a roommate who I think almost did the whole idolization of marriage, idolization of dating even. And I think a lot of it was we don't realize how much marriage is learning how to be a good roommate, first of all, and then also learning how to be a good friend. And I think if you're a single person and you're have a lot of trouble with roommates, or you have a lot of trouble maintaining long-term relationships and long-term friendships with people, if all of your friendships last maybe 1 or 2 years before there's some conflict and it's over, then I would really, maybe do a little reflection about, what kind of things are happening. Is it the kinds of friendships I have? Is it just how I'm relating to people? What is it? I would also, if I can plug some resources, emotionally healthy spirituality is a really good one. The other one that's a really good one is Boundaries in Dating. And I think that book really helped me because I myself was in a really unhealthy relationship when I first entered college. And I had no idea what a healthy relationship looked like. All I knew was everyone said, well, dating is super hard and marriage is super hard. So when this relationship was really, really dysfunctional, and in my heart, I was like, this is really hard, I thought that that's what it was supposed to be like. And I read this book, and it really talked about what does a healthy relationship actually look like? What are healthy and unhealthy behaviors? Because again, you're not going to see these kind of things in your rom-coms and on The Bachelor or The Bachelorette. It's really not, that's not where you're going to see what a healthy relationship is. And I would say those things that I learned helped me to be a better friend, helped me to have more patience with my roommates, and ultimately really helped our marriage relationship, I would say.
I would agree with that. In case you don't know, we're married. I don't know. There might be someone in here who doesn't know that. And I would also agree with those book plugs. They were excellent. And yeah, so I think that was a really good segue. One of the things that seemed to be kind of coming up was this idea of really good relationships in the church between the married and the unmarried. But now I'm kind of wondering, how should the singles within the church relate to one another? Because I work a lot with students, and I can't even count the number of times where a young man has told me that every time he sees really any female, right, they can't help but objectify them. And so they haven't unlearned or even learned, how to relate to someone of the opposite sex well in a healthy way. So could you guys just speak a little bit to that?
So I'm going to suggest something. Whoa, there we go. You can really hear me now. I'm going to suggest something kind of radical, right? Jesus says, if your eye causes you to sin, pluck it out. If your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. One of the things that really helped me early on be really victorious over sexual sin when I was 16 years old, it was getting in my head that I was never getting married. And I didn't convince myself of that like as a trick. I was really I was just so radically transformed by Jesus that when I opened 1 Corinthians 7, and if you haven't read passages on singleness, go read 1 Corinthians 7. It's a great place to start. And there, Paul is so in favor of singleness that you'll read it and be like, oh, no, I don't feel like I should get married, right? And I don't think it's necessarily the right reading of it, but the point is, Paul is an advocate for singleness. And I read that chapter, and I was like, well, if it's good enough for Paul, it's good enough for me. And I stopped looking at pornography, and I stopped masturbating, and I stopped lusting after women because every woman was now my sister. Were there times of struggle? Yes, there were, but not nearly to the extent that there had been. And why? Well, let's face it. Consider this, and this is a bit crude, and I'm going to try to be careful what I say. But why is it that in other cultures, like in ancient Greece, exploitation of children was pervasive, and most of the wealthy population did it? Think about that. If you were powerful, you were probably exploiting little boys if you lived in ancient Rome or Greece. Was humanity so much darker then? Or do our socially accepted mores actually have a deep and profound impact upon our morality and what we even allow ourselves to do? Because I think for most of us today, that is is an abomination, right? We don't even go there. The thought is you want to beat people up that go there, right? At least I do. And yet, a lot of the powerful were doing this 2,000 years ago. Now, how does this relate to what I was saying? Well, if all of this sudden it is not there is no reason to sexually, not even idolize, what's the word, objectify women or men, or if there's not a reason to sexually objectify someone, we're still sexual creatures, like I said, so you're still going to have some struggle. But that struggle goes down a lot. It's actually, I'll be honest, I found in some ways there was far more struggle then when I got in a relationship again. Because then the status of your sexuality is all of a sudden a bit confused, a bit gray. It's especially in an unmarried relationship, but even in a married relationship, right? There is some sexual outlets. So I actually had to work through those struggles. But that's not the only solution. But I do want to suggest to some of you single men, if you're not in a relationship, stop making an idol of it. Guess what? Sex is never going to pay out the way you think it's going to. Right? I mean, we all know. It's a very, very small percentage, even if you're the most sexually fulfilled person in the world. It's a very, very, very small percentage of your life. Do you really want to live your life consumed with that? And if you don't, actually embrace the idea of following God with all your heart and maybe even putting aside marriage completely. And then if you're able to do that and learn what that looks like, then maybe God will say, okay, you're now the kind of person who's ready to be in a relationship and treat your spouse with the honor they deserve. It's just a radical thought.
Yeah. So I have two things to say. The first one is there was this really great TED Talk from a while ago. It was called Why Women Shouldn't Wear Bikinis. And the talk was all about, so I'm also a human development major from college, and my whole thing was like about how the brain works and how it influences behavior and such. So this was really interesting to me. Hopefully you'll find it interesting too. But it was a study that they did about the different parts of the male brain. And all of us have a part of the brain that is the relational part that helps us connect with people socially. And then we all have a part of the brain that is for like using objects, like tools, like how do you use tools, how do you drive a car, that kind of thing. And this study had a bunch of pictures of women. Some were fully clothed, some were wearing bikinis, and they showed all these men the different pictures. And overwhelmingly, when these men were shown the pictures of women in bikinis, the part of the brain that lit up was not the social connectedness part, but the part of the brain that is used when you use tools. And so literally, the brain was viewing these women as objects to be used for something. And I think when you look at a study like that, you know, it's like, I think sometimes, you know, women can think, oh my gosh, men are such jerks. Like, how come they like view us as objects and things like that? And part of it is, you know, God wired them this way. And I'm not saying that there's no fault at all in the male brain. Like, I think that, you know, we can, you know, there's still a place for self-control, right? But at the same time, there's a lot of it that just isn't their fault. And, you know, and there's still scriptures that talk about the renewing of the mind and all these kind of things. But I think that there's also things that just recognizing that this is the proclivity, right? I think if we know that, right, we shouldn't walk through life being naive to these things. And I think when we know that, we can do what we can to help our brothers. You know, like, think about, you know, what are the things that you are wearing? How are you acting around your friends of the opposite sex? You know, because there are things that you could do to possibly help them in their walk. And I think if we're calling ourselves brothers and sisters, you know, it's not so much about standing up for our own rights, but it's about laying down our rights for others. And so, you know, I'm not saying like, you know, you have to be totally self-conscious and like live your life so that you would never attract another man ever again. But what I'm saying is, you know, I think there's things that we can do to just kind of make ourselves not so alluring in different ways. And I think all you women know what I'm talking about. And hopefully you guys do too. The other thing I wanted to talk about was just purity of intention. Because I think even as women, we can sometimes get really lost in the whole like wanting to have a boyfriend or wanting to have a husband arena. And I think that can sometimes cause us to treat our brothers without purity of intention. And I'm not saying like it's necessarily sexually loaded, but it can be like, it can come out in behaviors, right? Like I think sometimes women are a little better at emotionally manipulating people than guys are. But I think, you know, just thinking about how I think when we interact with people, it's not about playing games, right? It's about just being genuine. It's about really trying to genuinely know this person, see how you can enter into their life as a sister, and how to love them as a sister. Yeah.
Okay. Well, so our time is just about up, so I want to kind of close us out with some final thoughts. we sort of broadly define singleness today. And I think the general direction we're headed is to say that we need to be content, not just content, but actually fully satisfied in our singleness. And so I'll get us started, but so that you have some time to think. But I'd like you to kind of offer up what is the game-changing revelation, teaching, or practice that really helped you to be content, not just content, but satisfied in your singleness. And so yeah, I'll get us started. One of the things that I think I realized before I started dating that was really key was more so a theological than a practical thing, was seeing actually how much in Jesus's life himself, he had healthy relationships with women in his life, whether that was Mary and Martha, who very clearly he had an intimate, meaningful relationship with, or the fact that he, when he first returned, he appeared to two women. It was really evident that there were meaningful relationships with women in his life. That then coupled with the hope that we have in knowing that Jesus not only was tempted in all the same ways that we are, but he never succumbed. It makes Jesus feel as though he is the model for a life that we can actually live with meaningful relationships with people of the opposite gender. So that was game-changing for me. What about for you guys?
Yeah, for me, the most game-changing component was not idolizing sex. Sex was what I had idolized, not necessarily the relationship. And so once I was able to put it on the back burner and realize, like Elijah was saying, that it's such a small percentage, and you can have sex without intimacy. Once I realized that, I really was like, you know what, I really want that intimacy with God. And so I just really accepted the stage that I was at. I really accepted like everything that I needed in my relationship with God, like how weak I was in that arena. And so that pursuit was really what allowed me to accept my singleness.
Yeah, I think for me, it was getting to a place where I actually saw everything clearly. I think going into college, like I didn't realize how much culture had really distorted my view of romantic relationship and also of sexuality. And so as a result, I did idolize romantic relationship. And I think because of that, like it really colored how I saw everybody. And I needed to be washed of that. And I think that came about by just spending a lot of time just pouring it out before God. Like if you look at my journal entries from like my single years, it's just a lot of angst. Like there's a lot of just pleading with God, and also just like asking him to like take a lot of things away from me that I knew weren't good things, and then just filling those things in with good things. I think the other part was just really learning how to put my trust in him for my future. Knowing that like even though I didn't know what would be coming 2 years down the road, like I just had to keep confessing to God, like, I trust you. Like, and I think it's because like I didn't really feel like I trusted God. But for me, it was like the more I like wrote it down and the more I would like say it out loud, like, that was how I like really kind of like, let God change my heart to like really be able to trust him. Yeah, and in the meantime, just like really not just like having that desire for like somebody to come into my life, to like love me as a husband and all this kind of stuff. But in the meantime, God, how can you grow me as someone who can love the people in my life really well? Let me be the best friend, the best sister, like the best like companion to the people in my life. And that was really helpful because that's, where God designed us to find our fulfillment in loving others and loving him.
Good stuff. Yeah, once again, see how practical this is. Yeah, so in a word, imagination. Imagination. I am not an art person. I like to think that I don't have much of an imagination, but I've always been really good at fantasizing. And as many of you know, when you're young, teenager that can go, right? And my pre-conversion experience was imagination that was captivated by illicit sexual fantasies. And when I became a Christian, one of the things that I found was that what I had imagined, the utopia, the kingdom that I had imagined, was so much less grand than what I discovered reality was. But it's in a reality that is not yet, and so it's still in a reality that takes place in here. My eschatology before I was a Christian, if you will, eschatology is things of the end. And the end for me, the goal towards which I was heading, was, if you've seen Top Gun, it was basically that. When I was 14, I had a fantasy that I was going to be an Air Force pilot. I was going to go to the Air Force Academy. I was going to be an Air Force pilot. I was going to end up on some coastal beach as an Air Force pilot, and I was probably going to meet a babe on a beach who thought I was so hot, because I would be so hot, but I would also be an Air Force pilot, so that's another element. And then we'd live in some, like, coastal condo and just have this perfect life, right? And that was the kingdom for me. And then when I was 16, God broke into my life, and I got a new eschatology, and it looks like this. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride beautifully dressed for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "Look, God's dwelling place is now among people, and he will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away." He who is seated on the throne said, "I am making everything new." Then he said, "Write this down, for these are the words trustworthy and true." The kingdom, when I became a Christian, that is described here, I realized was so much more glorious than the kingdom that I had imagined. And this wasn't the end for me, because I still regularly, weekly, perhaps, create idolatrous kingdoms that I think will make me happy. But the way that I have found, the way that I live in alignment with the true kingdom, is by constantly renewing my imagination. It is not, in other words, by trying to suppress my perverse sexual fantasies that I actually find fulfillment, but by soaking in this picture of reality. Right? The passage goes on to describe all the people who won't inherit the kingdom of God. And it is a good thing that that kingdom does not consist of people that live out fantasies like I am capable of. Why? Because do we want to live in a world that continues to look like this one? A world in which we continue to objectify each other and then compete with each other, because once we've objectified that person, and they're now not a whole person, but they're just an object to be pursued and won, of course, I have to compete with the guy over there to make sure I get that person and he doesn't. And this is just one area. We do this with all kinds of area. Look at what's happening with the stock market this past week. Part of that is the desire to gain advantage over other people who aren't as smart or as clever as you, right? And it just so happened that the people in power right now are really upset because they're actually losing in their own game. And that's horrible. And every time we let these little visions of what utopia, of what the kingdom of God looks like, take up a place of pride in our lives, we are clouding out this true vision of the kingdom of God. So I don't mean to sound overly theological, but I really am convinced. If you want to find victory in your life, fall in love with the true future. Fall in love with the kingdom of God that Jesus has inaugurated, and that will begin to cloud out the other areas.
Well, all right. Thank you guys so much for everything that you've shared. Again, for great wisdom and especially for great vulnerability. If you, like me, have more questions now than you did before we started today, then I have a couple of invitations for you. First, please feel free, I am kind of speaking for them now, to ask your questions to them directly after today's service, or even if you resonated with what they shared, to ask for prayer for your situation. And then if you have more conceptual questions, we will, as we do with every mini-series, do a roundtable Q&A with the audience, and we'll figure out the logistics to keep that sanitary and safe. But we'll have that at the end of our mini-series on sexuality and marriage in a couple of weeks. And so with that, I'm going to go ahead and close for us.